Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Watch and Listen. Cameron, that looks like a different kind of background. Is that a secret where you're at, or can you reveal a little bit of information?
No, I'm in a shed. I'm in a garden shed right now. Yep.
Okay, that's new, but I guess it works. What's the shed for? For recording new podcasts, or for sheddy stuff like?
Podcast and storage, I guess.
Okay, multi-purpose shed.
Yeah.
Good idea. I should get myself a shed. All right, good deal. So in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to take a suggestion by one of our listeners, and we're going to explore it a little bit. That suggestion is, hey, why don't you guys ever talk about ladies' watches? That's a good question. Well, one of the reasons why at least why I don't talk much about ladies' watches is, well, I don't wear ladies' watches, and my wife doesn't like watches. So to me, that topic doesn't come up very much, but my mom is a big fan. In fact, she has a couple of pieces. One of them I actually showed on the first, was it episode 1 or 2, is that JLC Reverso. She has a Bauman Mercier and some other stuff as well, I believe. It's kind of hard to track these days. But yeah, I don't have much experience with ladies' watches, but before the episode, I kind of jotted down some watches that I see on ladies, and I think they're wonderful watches, and we could discuss them. So how's your experience with ladies' watches?
I mean, it's limited. Not being a woman, I don't. It's really hard for me to get into that part of the watch world.
Right.
But one thing I've always been confused about is like, I think of watches a little more like I think of cars. Mm-hmm. And to me, there's not really a women's car. Yeah, they are cars for everyone, and it depends what you like. So I think there are certain watches that women tend to lean towards for certain reasons,
right?
But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have like a completely women's segment of the market. If that, I don't know how well that's understood, but
I understand. I get it.
Yeah, like it doesn't have to be a men's watch that's been shrank down tiny and adding jewels and pink and things like that. There's a place for that.
Right.
But
yeah,
for a watch enthusiast, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. You like the craft, you like the watchmaking, you like the quality of fine timepiece.
Right.
And to me, I mean, a lot of the modern watches kind of lean really large to the point where, with a small wrist, even for a guy, they're kind of unwearable.
Yeah.
But the vintage stuff is kind of cool because it's in a crossover size.
Ooh, this is going to get interesting.
36 to 38 range,
right?
I think is a great watch size for women and men.
All right.
So for women, it's actually kind of cool. They can get some really awesome vintage pieces that are like 32 to 34, and they don't have to compete with any of the men in the vintage market because they don't wear a watch that small.
Right.
So some of the, a Vacheron or something like that that's 32 millimeters or 34 millimeters, it's going to be really undervalued, even though it has an amazing manually wound movement, ultra thin movement probably. It could be 18 karat gold and just a gorgeous timepiece. But the market's not really screaming for that watch right now.
Yeah, well, the market tends to not scream for ladies' watches in general, or watches the smaller size. So I get where you're coming from, and I didn't even think about that, quite frankly. I mean, I think this is going to be a really good episode now that you brought that to the table, because a lot of people really underestimate what you could get in the vintage market. I'm a little terrified of the really, really vintage market, watches from the 50s, 60s, and kind of anything below or younger than or older than, I should say, the 1980s. Because I feel like they're a little bit more fragile. You've got a lot more on the manual wide side and the movements themselves. I've had a couple of experiences with some vintage Hoyers and kind of owning vintage timepieces here and there. And maybe I'm wrong with this, but it feels like that they're a little bit more fragile. And I'm a clumsy person. So there's a very good chance that I'm going to bump into something or hurt the watch or do something with it. I mean, you have one of my watches right now. It's well worn, we'll say. So I'm always kind of scared of the vintage stuff, but women are generally more careful than men. So I think you've got a really good point there.
Yeah, and I mean, vintage is definitely going to be more delicate. Vintage watches from that era, I'd say pre 1960.
Right.
Most of the vintage stuff, unless you're looking at like the very first Submariners or the very first dive watches, most of that stuff is going to be designed as a watch that was meant to be worn 1 day a week or special occasions only, just for putting on with a suit when you go in to meet your banker, things like that. So they weren't made for the same kind of rigorous wear that modern watches are designed for.
The good old days. The good old days were so much more glamorous. You had to actually dress up to fly. Like, remember those adverts for like Pan Am and all the other companies that were flying at that time? You actually wore a suit. You know, you light up your cigarette in first class, or not even first class, just like in whatever it was. I mean, I don't know if Coach existed back then. I'm sure it did, but it was such a more glamorous time. But anyway, I think maybe what we could do is we could transition to actual watches. So here's what I did on my end. So maybe what I'll do is I'll add that third category of vintage as well. I kind of split them into two different categories: feminine and masculine. Kind of more on the feminine side are a little bit more dainty, a little bit softer. Some of them have diamonds, which I'll ask you about, by the way. And on the more masculine side, it doesn't mean that the woman is masculine. I'm saying that the watch is a little bit more masculine, a bit more sporty, a little bit more contemporary. So basically, that's kind of what I've got. And then we'll throw in the vintage side as well, and see maybe we can see which watches compare, or maybe some of the modern stuff that I put in there. Maybe you have a vintage alternative for it. How's that sound?
Yeah.
Okay, kick ass. All right, so let's do this. Let's start with kind of the feminine side. So I kind of, there are watches that are watches, and then there are watches that are jewelry. So I had a hard time putting this one on the list, even though I think that the brand itself is a very good brand, especially the kind of the more artisan side of it, the LUC side. So my first pick was the Chopard Happy Diamond, because it's one of the very first watches. Like when I was growing up, my cousin, when she got married, her husband bought her this Chopard Happy Sport watch, and I was like, oh, this is a really nice watch for a woman. It's like really accentuates her kind of femininity, and I thought that it was a really great watch. So before we go into that, what I'll do is I'll actually pull up. I'll do a little screenshot here, and then we can actually look up and see what Happy Sport looks like. So go ahead and tell me what your thoughts on the Happy Sport. I think there's actually one on the Crown and Caliber website.
I mean, to me, it's an interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's really playing to that jewelry emotion,
right?
Instead of the watchmaking emotion,
right?
I think there are other women's watches that play a little more to the watchmaking emotion, which is what I'm really interested in. Being a watchmaker, I'm more focused on what emotionally draws me to a fine timepiece. But as far as like jewelry goes, you don't see another watch out there like this ever.
Right. Yeah.
The closest thing I would compare it to would be like some of those Cartier pieces.
Yeah.
Like with the Panther's face and all the gold beads that fall down in a pattern on the dial and form the Panther's face. Things like that are just like the amount of detail that goes into creating a jewelry piece like this is on a whole nother level.
Right.
But again, that's a different craft than the watchmaking. So it really kind of should have its own category. Like with Audemars Piguet in Switzerland, they have a watchmaking building, and then they also have a jewelry building.
Okay.
So you have the gem setters in one particular building, because you really need some of the best gem setters to work with watches.
Sure.
It's a very specialized category within the jewelry segment to be able to set gems, polish the tiny little settings, make sure everything is perfect. A lot of times with these jewelry timepieces, you have a lot of diamonds on one piece of jewelry. And to make sure that everything matches, everything's the right color, everything's really nicely set, everything's secure, it's an art form in its own.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of why I had a little bit of an internal struggle, I guess you could say, whether or not to put them on the list. But I put them on the list, and I'll explain why. Whenever you're decorating a watch, for example, let's say like a Vacheron, the decoration is an art, right? And so much of watchmaking is artistry. And a lot of people are like, no diamonds. Diamonds not a part of watchmaking. It doesn't really do anything for the watch. It's not mechanical. It doesn't really help. It's just it's an artificial kind of thing that, well, it's not really artificial, but you get what I'm saying, right? It doesn't really do anything for the benefit of the watch itself as the watch should be. It's more, it kind of moves it over into the jewelry side. But if you really think about it, if we open this can of worms, if you're looking at the back of a Vacheron or a Patek or whichever watch that is decorated, or like a Philippe Dufour, for example, which, obviously is decorated tremendously. If you're looking at a watch like that, that's art. And you can do art, like just like you said, with those falling diamonds on the dial side and on the bracelets and everything like that. So I do think that the Chopard is a good entry because it's a fairly affordable watch, especially on the pre-owned market. You're getting a lot of watch for the money. If you're buying a watch that is automatic from them, you're getting a good workhorse movement. Usually they're at 2892s. So that's kind of my thing with the Chopard. Do we have anything else to discuss on the Happy Sport, or should we go into the next watch here?
I mean, just if anyone hasn't seen that watch, it's the wackiest idea, and it fits in the watchmaking category, I think, because a lot of it is like, well, why would you want a watch that only has a 48-hour power reserve when you can get a quartz that will run for 5 years and be more accurate?
Right.
And it's like, well, that's not what it's about.
Yeah.
I wanted to put these diamonds inside 2 crystals on the front of the watch face so that they were floating around because I can.
Right.
Like
pull up some other ones here.
That's really what it's about. Is just doing these things because you can. So I think that's always cool to me to see people creating something different and unique like that.
Yeah, and it also kind of reminds me, I'm sure, that maybe in a way that it influenced like Parallel when they did that Tourbillon oscillating weight. It's something different. And when you have a dial that is filled with diamonds, or you have a bezel that's filled with diamonds, that's wonderful. But when you're actually wearing the watch, I don't know if hopefully it comes through the zoom here, but if you take a look at the dial, they're kind of stacked right here. It's not permanently stacked, by the way. If you guys are able to see one in person, or if you just Google or YouTube a video of the Happy Diamonds, I think one of the reasons why they gave it that happy name is because it's really kind of a happy watch. When these diamonds, when you're wearing them, they're jumping kind of all over the dial. It really kind of makes you happy. And it's such a silly thing. It's so much fun. That's why my cousin really, really enjoyed that watch. And in fact, she received many watches and purchased many watches after she had this one. But this one was always kind of the one that she came back to because it's kind of a conversation starter. When you're walking around and you see something on the dial that's moving around, some people are like, hey, your watch is broken. And then you can actually have a conversation with them about it. And that, to me, is also about watchmaking and watch hobby, horology in general, is when you can have that thing, whatever it is that you're wearing, start up a conversation. So that's kind of where we're at. Like this thing is tiny, but if it wasn't for these diamonds, you probably wouldn't look at it twice. I mean, it looks very similar to a Cartier with these little rubies or whatever these are, these stones. But it is definitely pretty unique. I believe this one's probably quartz. Let's take a look. Yeah, it's 26 millimeter quartz. So this is more along the lines of what you were saying with the whole quartz thing. So I think that the better watch, and not for that much more money, for what, $300 more, I would probably go with this one if I was giving this as a gift. But anyway, anything else?
No, I mean, but what you just said does touch on an interesting subject as far as the quartz versus mechanical argument in women's watches. I think a lot of people just immediately assume that mechanical is better, when really it has to do with what you want the watch for.
Right.
If you want the watch to simply look at it and enjoy it, enjoy the gems, enjoy the dial, and just enjoy it without having to work on it, without having to wind it, without having to set it, that can be annoying. If you had 10 watches and you're rotating through them, it can be annoying to try and get the time right on every watch when you wear it.
Definitely.
So I think there's definitely a place for quartz. I own quartz watches. I don't think that they're less than or greater than mechanical watches. I just think you buy one for a totally different reason.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I would agree with you 100%. I would say that, in the case of ladies' watches, I would say the quartz are probably more along the lines of jewelry than actual horology. But, I mean, you buy what you like, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more prevalent mainly because of the size.
Probably, yeah.
What happened is a lot of the women's watches are small, and that really doesn't fit with the modern mechanical movements that are available.
Right.
Small mechanical movements today are actually quite large compared to the mechanical movements from the 20s and 30s that were in women's watches. But good luck finding a watchmaker that will work on and service a tiny mechanical movement from one of those watches. So there just isn't, in that small watch category, you don't have the mechanical movements available, which
So is
makes it
that,
very tricky.
yeah, is that what happened historically, I guess? Or maybe if you could kind of shed some light on it. I mean, if you really, there are a few brands, obviously, that are really, really good at very, very tiny movements. JLC is one of them. Like, for example, my mom's, what is it, 28 millimeter watch, that JLC Reverso has a manual eye movement. And there are obviously brands. What's the one that starts with a P? I always forget it. The maker of really, really, really tiny movements is a Piaget. Piaget. So, for example, you got brands like Piaget, and then JLC has a couple of really tiny movements. But for the most part, you don't really see very small movements anymore. And yes, like we're going towards a larger watch period, and women are starting to wear, men's watches. So we are going in that direction. But like, if from an industry perspective, were the movements smaller because obviously they're much more difficult to work on, or like what kind of happened? Maybe you can, expand on that more.
Well, when we didn't have quartz watches, everything had to be mechanical.
Right.
So you had mechanical that was whatever size you needed for the watches you wanted to produce. So at the time, women wanted a much smaller watch. And so there were mechanical movements to fit those watches. As mechanical movements were phased out, then you have quartz coming in, and it's much easier to make a quartz movement for less money, much smaller. So if you don't have a huge demand in the marketplace for small mechanical watches, then you're going to stop producing your small mechanical movements, and you're going to move into quartz because it's less expensive to produce. So there's still a demand for small watches, but the demand for small mechanical watches was disappearing.
Got it.
So that production it just disappeared from the watchmaking industry.
Right. Okay. That's a shame, because I would think that it's so much more technical to make something that much smaller. And you would think that.
Oh, it is. It is.
Yeah, it's mind blowing to me seeing movements that are from the 20s, 30s, 40s and on, that are these tiny little beauties of mechanical, just, I don't know, I guess prowess is the way that I would describe it, because in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, I mean, even 60s and 70s, the technology wasn't available to us the way that it is available here. I mean, the CNC machines that people are using now to make movements were not available. So it was so much, for me, it's going back to that kind of like the artisanal side of watchmaking, which was really exciting. But again, because it's so dainty and fragile, it scares the shit out of me. But anyway, should we continue on to the next brand of watches, or what do you want to do? Do you have anything else to add to that?
No. Let's see another watch.
Cool. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to talk about a brand in total, because there's so many watches that they produce that are really great for ladies. And again, this is kind of a brand that is really mostly known for their jewelry, but they are really, really strong in the watchmaking world. I mean, they've been doing this for a very, very long time. If you look up their history, they were pioneers in the watchmaking industry as well. And that brand is Cartier. So Cartier, for me, it wasn't as difficult to put them on the list with regard to Chopard because, again, of that whole history. So my favorite pick, because again, I saw my cousin has one of these. I mean, I'm basically basing this off of my cousin's collection, to be quite frank. She has I think it's called the Santos Demaswell. I don't do very well with French. And for them, like the tanks and the Ballon Blues, the more contemporary watch. I mean, these things are just beautiful, and they're constructed so well. So, what's your opinion on Cartier? While I will come up here and show the folks, some examples of them.
I like Cartier a lot. I think not only do they have very unique watch designs, but they also are establishing themselves really well in the mechanical watchmaking realm, on top of their very unique case designs and bracelet designs. And I think they do a very good job with their overall watch offering.
Right. Okay. So can you kind of give us a little bit more on their movements, if we're talking about like some of their major achievements, just like a brief history? Maybe that'll kind of give people a little bit more of an understanding as to how serious of a watch house I think they are.
I mean, they purchased a lot of their watchmaking know-how, but that's not like a bad thing. It's just they don't have a long history of the watchmaking side. They were, when they started, it was more of the design side of designing the exterior of the watch, what you see,
right?
Which so they were a jewelry brand that made watches that looked good.
Yeah.
And just unique designs. I mean, they created the first, what was it? The first pilot's watch, right?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. But things like that, they're forgotten about often because they're not in they're not considered like master watchmakers or things like that with a lot of heritage in the making of movements.
Right.
Which a movement is great, but if the watch doesn't look good, then who cares what's inside?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I agree 100%.
So to have all those extra design elements that go into the exterior of the watch, I mean, whether you like it or not, doesn't really matter. It will appeal to someone because it is unique.
Right. Right. Yeah. And like, just to switch over to men's watches really quick. I mean, if you guys really don't think the Cartier is a solid watch house, I mean, take a look at this. And they've got some incredible high complications. They've done some really, really incredible work, like this Rotonda, the Cartier. I mean, it's unbelievable. I believe this is a minute repeater. If not, it's a grand complication. I mean, think about the ability that they need to have in order to make a grand complication. I mean, you're the master watchmaker here, so you could probably extrapolate on that further.
Yeah, I mean, those watches have thousands of pieces inside of them.
Right.
It's the top. Producing something like that is really the pinnacle of watchmaking.
Right. Yeah. And, within recent years, I mean, Cartier's really been pushing watchmaking and really focusing on what watchmaking is, and actually, I think in many ways proving that they're very capable, not just by making jewelry. I mean, obviously their jewelry is probably their bread and butter. That's probably the majority of their business, but I mean, I don't know their internals, but their watches are absolutely spectacular. Is there like a particular watch that you really, really like from Cartier, whether it be men's or women's?
I like their dive watch that they do for men's.
Okay. And
then the Ballon Bleu, I think, is just an amazing watch.
Yeah. I agree. I would place the Ballon Bleu in the category of some of the most iconic watch designs, right up there with the Submariner, right up there with, let's say, like the Calatrava. Calatrava's a little simple, but you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, like it's a totally unique design.
Totally, yeah.
And it's like, how did they come up with this?
Yeah.
It's just like the dial meeting the crown and the case being perfectly round, but having the crown within the case is just like, that's beautiful design work. The design language in that timepiece is something you won't find elsewhere.
Absolutely.
I just think it's a cool watch.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very, very unique. I mean, the detail on it, that's actually, I think, what certain watch houses that have a jewelry aspect to them, I think that's sometimes what they do really, really well, and sometimes better than just a watch brand that doesn't have a jewelry arm, is that real fine attention to detail. So I'm going to zoom in on a couple of portions of this Ballon Blue. I mean, they have the iconic, what would it be called? I mean, is it a ruby? It's a gemstone, right? Some sort of a gemstone that they have on the crowns here.
Yeah.
So
That's sapphire in there.
sapphire. Okay. So look, just the detail of the sapphire. And if you take a look at the crown, you've got these little, I wouldn't even know how to call them, maybe like for traction. How would you call that? The little kind of ridges here.
It's like a knurl, but it's really more like a coin edge kind of thing.
Right. Coin edge.
That
There
they've
you go.
got going on.
Yeah. So they've thought this through. And my question to you from a technical perspective, whenever you're servicing a watch, you follow your certain steps and you can pull the crown out and then you can continue to service the watch. How does this work?
Well, I never worked on Cartiers,
Okay.
but I could tell you there's definitely some little things that a lot of people don't think about when
Right.
you're working on watches like this. If you're watching this, you'll notice the crystal is not round.
Yeah.
It's round, but it has a half moon cutout on one side.
Right.
So crystals like this and gaskets like this and case openings like this and dials to match like this, everything is made to match. And it is much easier to make all of those things round.
Yeah.
To then add this half moon, you're really messing with your manufacturing to get that all perfect and have it sealed and watertight. Little things like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
they can drive costs significantly, but it wasn't about the cost. It was about the design intent. So to me, that's really cool when it actually comes through, because someone could have drawn this watch, a designer could have drawn this watch and submitted it to manufacturing, and manufacturing could have come back and said, let's make it round, just perfectly round. Let's eliminate these little details that make it unique.
Right.
And then it would just be any other watch.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the fact that they stay true to the original design on their pieces is really cool to me.
Yeah.
This one too. I mean, the crystal here is somewhat rectangular, but you have rounded sides and the top is skinnier than the bottom.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, but it creates the overall look of the watch. If you changed any of that, it would be like any other rectangular watch.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And that's why I put Cartier as kind of like my top brand for, not even so much for ladies. I mean, for men's watches as well, although I do think that they're far more creative on the ladies' side, which is kind of a rarity, because when you take a look at other brands, they're like the majority of their creativity is going to be towards the men's side, because that's my assumption is, law of supply and demand, that the men's watches are probably going to be higher demanded. So that's probably why they put more R&D and just more into that watch. But Cartier tends to be one of those kind of outliers that actually focuses on both lines and focuses really well. I mean, take a look at the intricacy of this bracelet. I mean, it almost looks like a Cuban link type of thing. I'm assuming this isn't easy to make.
No, none of it is.
Right. Yeah. So if you really are looking for a watch, and if you are kind of in that camp where, Cartier's jewelry, well, I think actually in the case of Cartier, their jewelry experience and their ability to manufacture jewelry so well actually helps them make a better watch.
And again, watches, it's all jewelry.
Right. Well,
it's all jewelry. It's especially now that that we don't really need a watch. We have the time. So that really, I mean, that solidifies it right there.
Sure. Yeah.
It's jewelry. It's over the top. It's art.
Yeah.
Art and jewelry. And then it's just a matter of, are you going with the mechanical version or are you going with the quartz version?
Right. Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And one other thing that I really love about their attention to detail is if you take a look at the bottom left corner of the dial here, it says Cartier. very, very quietly on the bottom here. And if you're a big fan of industrial design, I mean, take a look at the design of this dial. These Roman numerals look nothing like any other watch on the market. It's just so unique, so different. And if you are still not convinced, I mean, go to either a Cartier retailer or, try to find your way out. Man, it's difficult right now with COVID and everything like that, but try to get your hands on a Cartier and you'll understand they're built amazingly well. And again, I think it's that ability for them to really transfer that know-how of making the bracelets and the chains and everything and so on, that gives them the ability to make something this great. I mean, for $3,000, let's see, it is a quartz watch, but again, we're not really, at this point, we're not really concerned about whether it's quartz or automatic or manual. You're getting so much design, so much artistry in this watch. I just love it. All right, so let's see. We did Ballon Bleu. I mean, this is obviously the classic, the Santos. Then that Demoiselle. This is obviously a little bit more traditional, I guess you could say. It's not that crazy of a design, but it still is really, really interesting in the sense that, like, it's very rectangular. I mean, again, it's got that kind of Bauhaus type of look. And if you're looking at anything that is kind of similar, that you'd have to go into the Audemars Piguet territory or something like Agenta design, which is going to be a lot more money. This is a solid gold watch for $7,200. That's pretty good bang for the buck, if you ask me. All right. Anything to add on Cartier? Any specific piece that you think we should take a look at on the ladies' side or on the men's side? You mentioned the diver. We could take a look at the diver.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's really cool about what are considered ladies' watches, or like women looking for watches in general. I dislike the whole ladies' watches, men's watches thing. They're just watches. But the cool thing for women is you can have women's watches, men's watches, whatever. The whole market is open. Yeah. For men, a lot of times the women's stuff can get a little too flashy. So like, I don't want something like that, but again, also the vintage, like there's a lot of vintage pieces that I can't wear as wristwatches, at least, because of the size.
Yeah.
Even though they were originally meant to be a men's watch. So I don't really think that it's like a men's women. It's more of just size and taste,
Right.
But we have this men's and women's kind of thing in the watch world. So we kind of live within it, I guess.
Yeah. All right, let's see. So we've got the Cartier thing down. Let's move on to another brand. Okay, so one of my favorite brands is coming up next. And the reason that they're one of my favorites is because of the sheer amount of movements that they've produced. I believe they're probably the most prolific when it comes to manufacturing, and well, maybe not the manufacturing side, but the design of movements. And we're talking about JLC. So we talked about this watch on the very first, or again, I don't remember if it was the first or second episode of season 2 when I came back on, when I came on board. But I think it's important to really look at this brand for a couple of different reasons. One of the primary reasons is what we were talking about earlier in the episode, is smaller mechanical movements have basically disappeared. And JLC still has plenty of watches in that category, that tiny movement category that are out there. And I think that if you really get a chance to play around with them, there's nothing that whines like a JLC for some reason. There's a little bit more clickiness, but it feels more precision based. I don't know, maybe it's a completely subconscious thing that I have. Maybe that's kind of something that I talk myself into, but I don't know, something about JLC movements that's a little different than, let's say, like a Rolex movement. Like I have that Rolex, the date Rolex that I wear almost all the time. There is a certain amount of precision, but it's a little bit rougher. It kind of seems a little bit more clicky, a little bit less kind of, what's the word that I'm looking for? maybe evolved. I don't know. But JLC, and if you really have to check them out. Any watches that you think are in particular that need some attention from JLC aside from the Reverso on the ladies' side, or maybe any watch that a lady would wear from JLC while we're looking this up?
No, but again, Reverso I think is an amazing watch for men and women.
Right.
Unique design and a case that is just like, if you're a collector and you're interested in collecting things that are unique in the watch realm, you got to have one of these. I've always wanted one and haven't made my decision on which one. But at some point, I will own a Reverso because I really love the design.
Right. Right. And it came out at a similar time that the Cartier watches were coming out as well. So I think maybe that's why they're somewhat similar. But I mean, again, talking about technical prowess, this is a 23 millimeter watch. And yes, it is rectangular versus circular, but 23, I can't even imagine what the movement inside this looks like. I mean, do you happen to know any reference numbers from some of the tiny JLC watches, or maybe what we can do is we can Google. Oh, here you go. Caliber 8460 or 846-1 or /1. Let's see. You ever worked on any JLCs like this? Well, that didn't do anything.
No, I've never worked on a Reverso.
Are you familiar with any of these kind of, looks like a,
with these movements?
Yeah.
I've seen them before, but that's about it.
Now, when a movement is this small, is it more or less accurate? I mean, is there a problem with the movement being this small, or
no? There's no problem.
Okay.
They can be a little tricky to regulate sometimes, because the parts are very small. The balance wheel is very lightweight. The hairspring is tiny. But really, for a good watchmaker, it shouldn't be any problem. But yeah, sometimes regulation can be tricky.
Right.
Just because it's tricky doesn't mean that good watchmakers can't do it.
Right.
It really, big or small, any good watchmaker should be able to handle it.
Okay. So, folks, if you take your watch to a watchmaker and he or she say nope, you should find yourself a different watchmaker. All right. Here's just another one with a different kind of dial with these cool numerals. I'm a big fan of Massimo Vanelli. I don't know if you've ever heard of who he was, but he basically was an industrial designer that did a lot of work for the New York subway system and furniture, and basically most of what we're dealing with is a visual thing, right? When we look at a watch, it's either attractive to us or not, and his work is absolutely stunning. If you guys have a chance, there's a documentary that I would recommend that you watch on him. Again, this goes back to the kind of the artistry. I think that when it comes to the dials, because the dials maybe or the watches are a little bit smaller, a little bit more creativity on the dials seems to be kind of more of a thing when you're looking at ladies' watches. I mean, this is the watch that my mom has here. It's just sometimes a little bit more interesting. I don't know. Maybe I'm kind of warming up the ladies' watches for absolutely no reason at all, but that's kind of where I'm at. Any suggestions, or should we go on to the next brand? Anything to add about JLC?
Nothing to add about JLC, but I do think, if you're watching this podcast, chances are you're a collector or you're going to become a collector, and you shouldn't limit yourself based on like certain types of watches, I don't think. So like if you're a woman and you're making your watch collection or trying to figure out, interesting watches, I wouldn't recommend to just look at women's watches. I would certainly not recommend that. There are so many men's watches out there that fill a different part of the market.
Right.
So again, it's back on men's versus women's watches, but like I will have a dive watch, very utilitarian, boring, black dial, white print, rotating bezel. Like they're all very similar, but I get something very different from that watch than what I get from an ultra thin vintage Vacheron.
Right.
One's not better than the other. They serve a different purpose in my collection.
Sure.
And I seek out things for that reason, that they are different. So one thing I would recommend, if you're looking for something different and it happens to fall into the women's category, I really love the antique brooches. It's essentially a very small pocket watch that has been turned into a brooch. So you have the art that goes into the design of the case, but you're also dealing with brands like Patek and Vacheron. So that's kind of the idea of it. These pendant brooch watches, but a lot of these are just cheap throwaway kind of versions that are up here.
Yeah.
But that's what it will kind of look like. Now that purple one with the enamel.
Which purple one? Let's see. Purple one. The one on the right side here?
No. Scroll down.
Scroll down.
So see that beautiful enameling right there? Yeah. Look at that.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's artistry.
I mean, exactly. And you can click through, maybe you'll see a maker on there.
Doesn't look like there's a maker. There's nothing on the dial, but it looks like it's a porcelain dial. Yeah.
Because oftentimes these types of pieces will not be signed on the dials. However, I've seen, from some of the top makers, these unbelievable, they're gorgeous. And it's not something you'll wear on your wrist, but it's something that if you're interested in collecting fine timepieces, I don't think that these should be ignored because they are so undervalued.
Okay.
And they include the art of watchmaking. They include the art of jewelry, case making, enameling, gem setting. Like some of the enameling that goes on is just gorgeous.
Yeah. I mean, look at this one. It's a work of art. It's like a Rembrandt, but a tiny little Rembrandt.
Right. And some of these would be like in the hundreds of dollars.
That's unbelievable.
For, an overlooked watch.
Right.
Because they're just not really trendy right now. And a lot of men steer clear of these because they see them as women's items.
Right.
But I don't really think that matters. It's not like you're going to be wearing it anyway. It's a collecting kind of keepsake.
You hit something here. It's really interesting that an artist can demand such crazy prices. I mean, Rembrandt's, for example, or Peter Paul Rubens, or any of the masters, let's say, or even more contemporary stuff like Rothko. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases, and the talent and the skill to do something like this, I would say, is equivalent, if not sometimes more challenging, because you have such a smaller canvas. I mean, if you take a look at the artistry here, I can't see this being more than, let's say, 30 millimeters in diameter. This is crazy, crazy technical mastery.
Yeah.
And what's crazy to me is that they're valued, they really don't have much of a value if you're talking about hundreds of dollars. I mean, that's crazy to me that they're valued so poorly.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely depends on the piece and where it's being marketed and sold.
Right.
But if you're looking in the right places, you can find some really amazing pendant style watches. Like there's a Patek with it has a guilloche on the that might just go through and show you all of the ones that were in this auction.
Yeah.
But look at some of these cases.
Yeah, it's unbelievable artistry. I mean,
and that's solid gold.
Yeah.
Right? And this one went for a lot of money because it was in a certain auction.
Right.
Where people were looking for that.
And it's also a Patek, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, the hands are unbelievable. I can't even imagine how. I mean, I'm sure that this is basically someone taking a small piece of gold and twisting it and finagling it and soldering it just to make it look that way.
No, that would be cut.
Cut. Okay.
Yeah, cut by hand.
It even crazier. I mean, to have a
Yeah.
file that small is it's unbelievable artistry, and you could just see the detail in this watch. It's impeccable.
Yeah. So I think sometimes stuff like that, it slips through the cracks simply because it's been categorized as a women's item
Right.
in this market that seems to be kind of predominantly male collectors,
Sure.
which for everyone, I kind of think that's a good thing. We can all jump on these deals, whether you're a man or a woman.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I've got a little bit of a problem with the connection, but we'll push on. I think we're okay now. Yeah, so we're running kind of close to where we need to stop because we do have another guest that we're going to be recording very shortly. But let's see. Can you hear me okay, Cameron?
Yep.
Okay, good. We're back. But I do want to talk about a couple of brands that are contemporary brands that I've seen many women kind of navigate towards and wear, and they're spectacular pieces. A lot of them, pretty readily available. Some of them are a little expensive because they're stainless steel models of a particular brand that is going crazy with prices. But one of those brands is obviously Rolex. I mean, I see a lot of women wearing Daytonas, for example. I mean, I think that's a wonderful watch. It's not too big. It's not overpowering. It's a kick-ass watch in general. Women are wearing GMTs now. I know of a person who just bought herself a Everose GMT. I actually do think like Everose on a woman just looks better than it does on a man for some reason. I don't know why, but it just does to me. Any other suggestions? You were talking about like contemporary pieces to consider.
I think Audemars Piguet has done a really good job.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I don't love about what they did so they came out with a Royal Oak. I think it's a 37 millimeter Royal Oak line.
Okay.
Automatic. The only issue I have with it is that the bracelets were a bit small.
Okay.
So
in terms of like diameter.
Diameter, yeah. Uh-huh. So if you're looking at it from as a lady's watch and you're a woman with a smaller wrist, not a problem at all.
Right.
If you have a bigger wrist, though, then it's a problem. You have to get a new watch, and then you have to buy extra links.
Yeah. Which
so
are not
even
cheap.
Though even though it's marketed as a unisex watch,
mm-hmm.
They didn't make the bracelet to fit unisex or to fit a larger wrist.
Right.
Whether you're a man or a woman. But I think this is where the market should be, is more on like, we're bringing our ethos, our artwork, our designs to wearable sizes for everyone.
Right.
Because if you want an Audemars Piguet for what Audemars Piguet is known for, then you shouldn't be limited to watches that are just covered in diamonds or have pink dials or whatnot. That's great if that's what you're looking for, right. That type of watch. But I feel like most collectors who are looking for an Audemars Piguet are looking for a Royal Oak, stainless steel Audemars Piguet, probably with a blue or a gray dial.
Right.
So to have that option in a size like 37 is really cool.
Yeah,
I agree. Think that they're on a good path. Getting their design to more people.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think that they're kind of going back to their grassroots, sizes and watches and things like that. I mean, the Jumbo was 39 millimeters, so that's making a huge. I wouldn't really say a comeback. It was always very popular, but getting a Jumbo right now for anything close to retail is unbelievably difficult, if possible at all. But there's a watch I think that a lot of people, and I think it's valued pretty well right now, is the Royal Oak Tantalum, which still is. I mean, look, the watch that you just discussed is $19,000 or roughly $19,000 new. I mean, obviously you could try to see if you could find it pre-owned. Go to Crown and Caliber and see if they have it. But the Tantalum is substantially less. and it's just as good in my opinion. And you might not actually have that problem with the bracelet.
Yeah, well, depending on which model you're talking about, a lot of those were originally men's watches. They're just vintage.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, we can't really get too much into the detail of the vintage because we're really short on time. Sorry, guys, but we do have another episode that we're going to be recording right after this with a very, very special guest. But you can always contact us on social media, and we'll see what we could recommend over to you. Cameron, you got recommendations galore. I mean, you are the person to go to for recommendations when it comes to that. So, guys, reach out. We'll be more than happy to have a discussion with you and see if we can help you. Is there anything else that you want to add to kind of close this up?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a female collector out there, definitely do not limit yourself to only looking at the women's watches.
Right.
You know, especially if you're interested in the mechanics behind it. It's a lot of brands, they seem to just ignore the watchmaking side. As soon as you click the women's link on their website, it's like a completely different market.
Right.
Which to me doesn't make sense for certain people who are just looking for, you know, an extension of the bracelet in, you know, pure jewelry form. Okay, that's one thing. But if you're at all interested in the mechanical aspect and the watchmaking aspect, then you got to look at everything. You got to look at the men's watches too. You got to look at those Audemars Piguets, like the unisex kind of version.
Right.
And then definitely check out all the vintage. There's just so much out there that's not only great design-wise, but wearability is really good too.
Yeah, I agree. All right, with that, let's wrap it up, Cameron. So let's go ahead and do our plugs here. Shoot.
All right, check out weisswatchcompany.com. Find us on Instagram, Weiss Watch Company. Yeah, and you can take a look. Our 38 millimeter is actually what my wife wears, 38 millimeter field watch.
Okay.
She wears the blue dial on a canvas strap. And I mean, she loves the size. I love the size too. I find myself wearing that one all the time as well.
Cool. Awesome. All right, yeah, guys, head over to Weiss Watch. Get yourself a damn watch. Also, make sure to follow the Crown and Caliber channel on YouTube and here. Make sure to subscribe. Click that little button, the subscribe button, and the little, what is it called? The bell, right? The notification bell. And follow me on Instagram at Road Stories Mike. Check out my other podcasts. They are kind of, I guess, stopped for the time being because I can't do 3 shows at a time. On Time Podcast, that's the old show that we did the watch discussions on. Road Stories Podcast, some pretty fun and amazing guests. Some guests are actually repeat guests of Road Stories here. So thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode. Cheers. Be safe.